Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Q&As, so let's knock this out. As usual, the first 8 questions are standard fitness related questions, mostly training related questions. The last 2 are going to ease kind of into TRT related. They're not really going to jump into full PED type questions at this point. One of them is going to be TRT related and fertility. The other is going to be about actually the space program, and then there's going to be a personal question at the end. So for people who aren't interested in any of that stuff, you guys can chime out after question 8, but let's get this started. First question. If someone trains each muscle part twice a week, natty body part split, does it need to use progressive overload every workout per week? No, not necessarily. As long as you have a general trend of progressive overload, you're going to progress. Now, if you're a novice lifter, yeah, your lifts need to be going up at least weekly. If they aren't, your progress is slow. You need to adjust something, you need to be on a different program, but it's also the question of, are you trying to make maximum gains? The thing you got to remember too, a lot of people are happy with any gains over time. The long gain, they're not necessarily trying to make the most gains per month or per year, everything, but if you're trying to make the most gains per year, you need to be progressing regularly as a novice. As more an intermediate, as long as every 2 to 3 weeks, each lift is increasing, even if you're training them twice a week, and the general upward trend is progression, you're still going to make close to the maximum size gains you're probably going to be able to make. That's why intermediates, you tend to start moving towards more types of block type periodization and things instead of linear progression, just because intermediate lifters are not going to be able to make that sort of progress. In advanced lifters, it's a totally different animal. There's almost no need to discuss advanced lifters because there aren't enough of them in my subscriber base to really address that, and they need specialized training anyways. So it's really going to vary depending on where you're at. So I'm going to assume with what you're describing, you're closer to an intermediate. No, as long as every couple of weeks each exercise increases, you can even have days to where you're a little lower, and because your general trend is progressive overload, you're still progressing on your weekly workloads and even your workloads from workout to workout. You're going to find that as long as there's a general upward trend, you're going to make gains and you're going to re-stimulate new muscle protein synthesis off those secondary workouts. And remember though, as an intermediate, a lot of times you're going to have slightly different training stimulus workout to workout. Meaning you're either going to be running some sort of block periodization or you're going to be undulating your periodization anyway. So you're going to have days that are higher intensity, days that are slightly higher volume, mechanical tension versus metabolic fatigue, etc. And then remember, if you're undulating the training, that progression becomes kind of a dual pattern progression. You're going to need to track just every 3 weeks. As long as each one of your individual training styles is increasing, you're probably going to be fine. Like as long as your heavier days you're increasing, as long as your volume days you're increasing, workload somewhere in there, everything's going to be okay. But no, every single workout obviously does not need to be a PR or even perfectly replicate the workout before to stimulate new additional growth. As long as the upward general trend is positive, you're going to grow off of it. You can get away with sometimes 3 or 4 workouts in a row of the exact same workloads and still make gains off of them. All right, next question. At what point does intake of vitamins and minerals become too much? Currently taking a multi 800 UI D3 and fish oil daily. Along with that, I'm eating 6 to 8 servings of vegetables per day and 1 to 2 fruits. My vegetables are usually dark leafy greens as well as some variety of colored peppers and carrots. I'm going to say you're probably potentially taking too much with a multi. What I would tell people is that if you eat a well-balanced diet, well-rounded diet, and you get plenty of fruits and vegetables in there, you probably don't need a multivitamin at all. You shouldn't even be considering one because, again, I've covered in the past the mixed reviews on multivitamins by various experts. There is no consensus on if they work, if they don't work, if they're safe, if they're dangerous. There is no general scientific consensus there yet. But what I would say is that taking them unnecessarily as some sort of insurance policy because there is potential risk there is a bad idea. As far as too much of any vitamin or mineral, you're actually going to have to go research every single vitamin and mineral and see if there's a toxic dose for that one. See if there's an amount that blocks the absorption of other ones, and you're going to actually need to research them individually. There is no general rule. There's over 20 different rules, so you're going to have to look into them. Something like vitamin C, for example, there's no toxic dose. Excess intake of it doesn't block your absorption of anything else, and if you take an excess, you just urinate it out. However, there are other things that are toxic and can damage your liver if you take too much. There are certain things like, again, zinc, that if you take too much, it'll block your absorption of copper and develop a deficiency. So it's not that straightforward. I would say that your diet sounds pretty balanced overall. There's probably no need for you to be taking that multivitamin. The thing that you need to remember is that, contrary to what a lot of people believe, lifters, people who lift as their primary form of exercise, not extreme endurance athletes, don't really have a higher need for most vitamins and minerals beyond the average person. Sometimes the minerals due to extra sweating, but you don't actually have needs above what most other people do as far as basic vitamins and minerals go. It's only endurance athletes like marathon runners, triathletes, people like that who seem to need a little bit more for their actual function and health. So just something to keep in mind there. So yeah, it is very much possible to reach an excessive intake or a toxic intake. So just be aware of that. All right, next question. Hey Jason, love your work. I train Muay Thai 5 nights per week at about 2 hours per session. I also lift weights 3 times per week. What kind of program would you have me do with the goal of maintaining and increasing size and strength? I don't do squats as I'm afraid of the DOMs would be too much with all the Muay Thai. Could this be true? Thanks, mate. All right, as you're a Muay Thai guy, you're going to do a lot of striking. You need to focus upon explosive power training. You're going to need to do some squats. You're actually not doing any sort of squatting is going to hurt your ability to kick with as much force as you possibly can. Getting a more powerful squat is going to help you there. However, again, you're doing a very large amount of conditioning work here. So again, only lifting 3 days a week is probably a good idea. You're going to need some sort of power-oriented program. There's a lot of different ones out there. So go out there and look into them. I mean, you could even run something as simple as West Side for Skinny Bastards and trim it down. You could get away with maybe my intermediate program, the off-season one, but I almost worry about with you doing so much conditioning work that my off-season intermediate program might be too much workload for you. So you might need to run something a little more conservative that only has you stick to the basics so you can get stronger and more explosive. But there are plenty of programs out there. Look into a lot of Joe DeFranco stuff. Look into some of the routines of some of the top MMA coaches out there. There's a lot of stuff out there. Just remember that your weightlifting is not going to need to contribute to your conditioning in any way. With the amount of conditioning work you're doing and technique work that you're doing, it's not a factor. Your weightlifting's primary goal needs to make you faster and more explosive, so you need to pick routines accordingly, which is going to be tons of heavy work or explosive work with lighter weights on all your big heavy movements. And again, lots and lots of core work. Train without a belt. Do all your squats, all your deadlifts beltless, your push presses beltless, and do extra core work, because you're going to have to take a lot of strikes and blows to the gut, and that's going to only help you there. But you skipping squats is definitely not a good idea if you want to be a stronger kicker. All right, next question. Hi Jason, I'm a soccer player who is wanting to do your 5x5 novice program. That's already a bad idea, but I'm thinking of changing it a little by doing the lower body lifts on a ramped up on work set style like Bill Starr's program to reduce soreness and DOMs for when I'm playing, but then going to doing the rest of your program as it is, or maybe only doing the lower body exercises once a week, only doing the lower body exercises on the second workout of every week. Also, I'm only semi-professional, so I only play soccer part-time, which means I have more rest days. My goals are to get stronger, but also to put some size on as well. All right, instead of my program, you're already a field athlete. That 5x5 is purely a hypertrophy program for people to max out their noob gains. You have more serious athletic goals. You're a competitive soccer player. You're semi-pro. Do not run my novice program. This is not the ideal thing. What I would recommend to you, I have an off-season intermediate linear program, which you can find. It's all over my stuff. It's in my programs playlist. That is a good possibility for you to consider. If not, you mentioned the way Bill Starr does things. The Bill Starr program was written originally for field athletes. It's been adopted by a lot of bodybuilders. It's been adopted by a lot of power builders and modified for their use, but it was originally written for American football players. They are field athletes. I would consider running Bill Starr's 5x5, also called Mad Cows, because it was written by a very well-respected, very successful coach specifically for field athletes, and it wouldn't be a bad choice for your goals. It's a good balance between developing strength and size, and it's not going to exhaust you the same way as some of these other programs will in terms of keeping you ready for your field sport. So just throwing that out there. All right, next question. I want to train for an endurance event. A 10-kilometer run equals 6.2 miles that requires me to do LISS and HIIT each 2 times per week, ergo 4 runs a week. What strength power building program do you recommend for these demands? Obviously high frequency, heavy squatting like on your novice program would be too taxing, right? I'm a late beginner, early intermediate lifter on no drugs and eating on a small caloric surplus. You need to fall back and do a basic strength program with no progression. So because you're peaking for an endurance event, no program that I have out is appropriate for you. And even if you were to run something like the Bill Starr's program or anything else, you have to drop the progression out. What you need to remember is that when you're peaking for some sort of athletic event or endurance event or preparing for it, you're not trying to make any progress in the gym. You're trying to maintain the strength and the muscle that you already have. So progression goes out the window. So if you're able to squat 315 for 3 reps, you're not going to try to increase it to 4. You're not going to try to increase it to 320 for 3 reps at any point during your peaking. Your goal should be to step back and keep it where it is. I would recommend some sort of basic undulating periodization program. I usually recommend linear periodization for off-season athletes, but when you're peaking for an event, you want to step back and do some sort of basic undulating periodization. Maybe full body 3 times a week would be fine, or an upper-lower split if that's what you want to do. But the thing is, you need to cease all progression. Don't increase the weight, don't increase the workload, don't increase the reps. And if anything, you might want to even step back the volume. You might want to consider even removing a set of everything so that you can focus more on the endurance and adapt to the endurance training without trying to adapt to your strength training at the same time, because that will actually not be ideal for peaking for your event. If you want to run that 10 kilometers as fast as possible, you need to keep your progression where it is on all the lifting and focus on the endurance work. That's just the reality of cross-training for different sports. You need to improve at one thing at a time, and sometimes that means being stagnant for a couple of months on one thing so that you can get better at something else while still maintaining where you are on the other. Just the nature of sports. All right, next question. I know soreness isn't an indicator of a good workout, but is it a good indicator of which muscles you targeted primarily? For example, in chinups, let's say your rhomboids are sore and your lats aren't. Does that mean you didn't perform the technique correctly? No, not at all. Soreness is caused by a host of different factors. What it could mean is that you put a certain stretch overload on a muscle differently than you have. You've put a new stimulus on it differently than before, or you've increased the volume that that muscle is subjected to. It's not an indicator at all of whether you work the muscle. And so when we're talking about it's not an indicator of a good workout, that means at the individual muscle level. Certain exercises, once you're used to doing that exercise, should never make the primary mover sore. So if there is no stretch reflex or stretch overload involved, and your workload isn't a big change in workload, or you haven't done like some slow eccentrics, you shouldn't be getting sore. So no, all that means is that if your lats aren't getting sore, but your rhomboids are, you changed something in the routine that's putting probably a deeper stretch on the rhomboids, but a stretch overload isn't always indicative of a good workout either, and it isn't necessary to stimulate maximum growth or even adaptation sometimes. So no, the soreness doesn't mean anything other than you subjected it to a new stress, or that you subjected it to a lot of stretch overload potentially. It doesn't mean that you stimulated any different growth than you have on previous workouts. So it's not an indicator at all. And when you realize is that if you go back and look at your first point, that it's not always indicative of a good workout, that should also apply at the individual muscle level as well. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that your lats didn't actually get more work than your rhomboids just because one muscle is more sore than the other. It doesn't mean that your rhomboids are going to grow faster than your lats do from that same workout. It just means they were subjected to a different level of stretch overload or a different level of eccentric loading potentially than they have been used to, which might, of course, stimulate more growth, but if it's not an increased workload on them, then it won't potentially stimulate more growth. So the soreness can be completely separate from it. It can sometimes overlap, or it can be completely exclusive. All right, next question. My grandfather, now 86, recently had a fall outside the house, and after being startled by a stray dog, fell and cracked 6 ribs and his pelvis. He's a lifetime desk jockey and has been in the hospital for close to 2 months now. What would be the best way to approach getting him into some kind of strength training, bearing in mind he has never been physically active? 2, he is incredibly frail at 86 and has been bedridden for 2 months with poor quality rehabilitation therapy. He still cannot even get out of bed on his own. You might want to get him some bars that he can hold on to, or a walker, and you're going to need to start helping him get out of bed and maybe help him do some basic body weight squats while he holds on to objects and you even help spot him. You're going to need to work on his basic mobility and his basic strength just to do things like that. At 86, this is going to be a slow process, and to be honest, he might not ever recover. Anything you're doing, you might want to discuss it with a physical therapist and his doctor. Make sure his doctor is clear with anything you do. But there are things you can help him do at home, again, if the doctor gives you permission. Your grandpa's 86 years old, and again, like you said, injured, has been bedridden. You might actually kill him if you're not careful. So you need to get medical clearance first. Talk to a doctor and see if you can talk with your doctor, run it through him or a physical therapist, what you want to do with him. But just helping him do basic reduced body weight exercises so he can just move his body through space and slowly build his strength and his range of motion and mobility by holding on to objects and learning to squat to the point to where he can eventually squat his own body weight and eventually squat his own body weight for reps. Maybe you could get him some little light bands or very, very light dumbbells. You could even just use soup cans. He doesn't even need dumbbells to just do some basic mobility work, basic strength training for him. Because again, the way that he is, something like just lifting soup cans with your arms for various exercises like laterals or front raises or overhead pressing or curls or anything is going to be a much larger workload than he's used to. That can actually help rebuild some of the lost muscle and some of the lost bone density at this point. It doesn't need to be anything even intensive. Things that you would think of as a normal workout are going to be so far beyond his capabilities are not even worth considering. Just lifting little things like soup cans with good form and learning to do body weight squats while holding onto the back of a chair or a walker is probably going to be more than sufficient to make massive changes. And again, even that could be so strenuous that if the doctor doesn't give you permission to do it, don't do it. All right, next question, and we're going to slip over to more of a TRT related question. And this one's interesting because this guy needs to talk to his doctor a little more about what's going on. Okay, the question is, I'm about to embark on a TRT journey, 39 this summer. T was at 200 nanograms per deciliter. What are the pros and cons of using HCG on TRT? My doc wants me on both, and I already have 2 kids and I don't want it anymore. I could care less about ball size. The ball size thing, HCG can help with that, but it's not necessarily going to be a problem. Not everyone on TRT or even anabolics has testicular atrophy, and people who have it, it doesn't always stay that way. It reverses oftentimes on its own. All right. The doctor probably wants you on HCG because he's hoping eventually you'll be able to come off the TRT. He's wanting to maintain your fertility. Talk to him about that and tell him that if you're not interested at all in fertility and you don't want to have to deal with the potential estrogen raising effects of HCG and have to counter that, and you don't want to stay on HCG long term because that can eventually suppress you too, explain to him that you're not interested in more children, you're not interested in maintaining your fertility, and make sure that that's not what he actually wants to do. Because again, you're looking at, for HCG therapy, you're looking at more injections, more money spent, more potential side effects that you have to counter, potentially estrogenic ones. And the main thing he's trying to do there is most likely to keep it to the point where he's hoping he can bounce you back enough to come off of TRT completely later, or he's doing that to maintain your fertility so that you can still father children. So you need to discuss that with your doctor and find out what his logic and reason is and why he wants you to do that, and have him explain it to you and discuss with him very clearly that you're not necessarily interested in coming off TRT and that you're not interested in fathering children any further. And if that's his motivations, then you might be able to drop that. But that's really a discussion you're going to have with your doctor on the individual level and understand why he wants to do certain things. And that's a good doctor will always be willing to explain those things to you. They'll be able to work with you, and if they should be able to explain to you in layman's terms specifically why they want to follow a certain course of action. And a good doctor will be willing to explain that to you. So sit down and discuss it with him. It's pretty simple. All right, next question. Hey Jason, recently Scott Kelly just got back from the 340 days in space testing the effects of long-term space travel on the human body. Yeah, we know those effects are pretty bad. What are your thoughts on this? Do you know of whether or not they're looking into anabolic steroids to counter the negative effects of bone density loss and loss of muscle mass? What possible downsides of anabolic steroids can you envision that would affect them in the long-term microgravity and would normally not be as big of an issue on Earth? Well, the thing in the microgravity, I can promise you they're looking into that, but the problem you're going to run into is because there's so much public eye on it and steroids have been so demonized, if they're doing it, they're going to be not wanting to discuss it a lot publicly or ease into it very slowly. Would anabolics potentially be much better than the loss of muscle mass and bone density? Well, every other disease that causes those things, most doctors who prescribe these things are more than willing to prescribe those drugs because the risk of anabolics are much lower as far as the risk to your health and your body than loss of bone density and loss of muscle mass is. It's the safer alternative. So for diseases, so it's probably going to be reasonable to say that most of the doctors who prescribe these things are going to say, yeah, it's reasonable. The risks to health are lower than the risk to health from the actual negatives that the drugs reverse. So I suspect they're going to mess with that a lot for space travel. That would be a very logical thing for them to do. Hopefully it goes in that direction, or they might mess around both with a combination of anabolics or maybe some SARMs for that purpose as space travel becomes more of a possibility. Oh, and he asked another question there. Let me answer that too. Lastly, what are your general thoughts on manned exploration missions of the solar system? I think it's essential that we eventually do manned exploration of the solar system. As far as our outreach as a species, our outreach as a society, our gathering of general knowledge, we're going to have to send obviously more robots and non-manned spacecrafts out there, but eventually we are going to have to do manned exploration of the solar system. It's going to be essential for our long-term resources. The only question becomes with certain economic issues we have is, can the United States really afford to do it at this point? The answer might be no, unless we build a whole new economy off of it and it helps bolster our economy. Otherwise, our country is too broke at this point to fund stuff like that. We can't even pay our own welfare. We can't even pay for our own veterans. We can't afford any of the stuff that we do, unfortunately, right now. So as far as funding its continuing space program, unless we make some changes in our country and the way we do things, we can't actually afford it. So it might end up being the Chinese and the Russians who end up beating us to that at this point. All right, last question, and this one is a personal question. A bit of a personal question, Jason. Can you reveal more about how and why you and your father's personal ethics and morals differ? What kind of condition experiences led to him developing his mindset? What was his upbringing fundamentally different compared to yours? Our upbringings were fundamentally different, vastly different. My father grew up, pretty much his parents were Czech immigrants who I think had come over during childhood. They met each other, and just the whole area were Czech and German immigrants, so everyone knew each other, and so everyone tended to be from the same basic ethnic and national background in that area. His parents got married when they were like 16 years old. My grandfather was a corn farmer and a cattle rancher, and my father was one of 7 children. He grew up in an environment where my grandmother was very cold, not very loving, raised 7 children. And again, in many Eastern European families, this is normal. Dad worked, mom raises all the children at the farmhouse, and they don't call her mother, they call her by her first name, and it was not a very loving environment. It was a very competitive environment. My father is a very intelligent man. His father was a hard worker, basic small business owner, businessman, and he grew up competing with other children for the attention of their mother, who didn't show a lot of love. That gave him a different mindset growing up. And you've got to remember, my father also went into the Green Berets, spent the last 2 years of the war in Vietnam as a Green Beret in Special Forces. Combine all that together, it creates a certain mentality. He was, again, a very successful businessman. My dad's always been a hard ass. My father tried to instill certain values in me, and some of that was changed a bit because my father was a lot of times out of town for work. My grandfather, my mother's father, who had been, it was actually a businessman himself, had been in the Navy, a naval officer, had been an Olympic shooter, been on the Navy shooting team. He spent a lot of time teaching me the values of being a man. So he taught me a different mentality. My father taught me at a young age how to be a warrior. So when people talk about, Jason, you seem like you're really violent or trigger happy or whatever, I'm really not. It's my basic mentality taught to me from a young age is basically that there is no such thing as a play fight. That when someone engages you, you hit them with everything that you have, you put them down, you keep them down, you hold nothing in reserve. That's the mentality of a Green Beret. My father taught me from like the time I was 4 and 5 years old, the whole military concept of violence of action. That is basically ingrained training in me at that point. It's not something I would consciously think about. So when I say that I would respond a certain way, I don't mean that I've thought those things through. It doesn't mean that that's what I would do out of anger. That's my reflexive training from my childhood all the way forward. So I was always taught from a young age that when you enter into any sort of physical conflict, you end your opponent. You make sure that they can never inflict harm on you again, and preferably you do it before they can inflict any harm. You totally neutralize the threat. You overwhelm them with extreme violence. You hold nothing in reserve. If they pull a knife, you pull a gun. They pull a gun, you shoot a missile before they can strike. As soon as the threat becomes a known, immediate, you strike hard with everything you have. My father's mentality ingrained in me at a young age. That's how my dad thinks. He was, again, a Green Beret veteran. Now he's in business. He applies that same model to his business models. A very successful businessman, multimillionaire. My grandfather, however, tempered that. My grandfather was again, also a veteran, but he was very big upon personal responsibility, accountability for your actions, thinking through the consequences of your actions, to be a peacemaker. And in my grandfather's mind, and this value instilled in me more, that if you have to fight, then fight with everything you have, but it's better to be a peacemaker than to fight. That small men use violence as a first resort, that a real man doesn't do that, that a real man, a man with any sort of honor, uses violence only when he has to. And when he has to do it, he again uses everything that he has. You destroy your opponent. You kill your opponent. Anyone who's a threat to you or your loved ones, you destroy them. But that's a last resort, never the first resort. That real men are peacemakers, that you find a way to come to peace whenever it's possible. And for me, most people who know me realize that I'm not like that. I'm more like my grandfather as a person, and that I'm a very calm person. It is unlikely to see me get really angry. It's very, very rare. Only certain things can set me off. Any of my exes will tell you the same thing. My current girlfriend will tell you that. All my family, my friends. I'm a very calm person. I'm a peacemaker. I'm always willing to talk through and negotiate with people. I'm very diplomatic. I have no reason to be in any sort of conflict where it's a verbal conflict, physical conflict. I have a different value on those things. Those things are last resort. It's always better to make peace than to fight. But if you have to fight, then you destroy your opponent. If someone becomes a threat to you, whether it's a physical threat, then they have to die. No question about it. You do everything you can to take them down. If someone becomes, a public threat to you, then you neutralize the threat. So if anyone becomes a threat to you in any way, you always neutralize that threat. But when possible, you make peace before that. If someone can be reasoned with, or if someone can be negotiated with, then you make peace before things come to that. But it's better to just be a calm person and diffuse conflicts, be a peacemaker. And so again, a lot of the values that I have are due to a different upbringing than my father had. My father had a much harsher upbringing than I did in a lot of ways. And I simply had a different role models. My father wasn't necessarily my role model. My father taught me a lot of things in life, but he wasn't my role model. My grandfather was my dominant male role model. And he taught me that a real man is slow to anger. We think through our actions logically. We are compassionate. You protect the weak. That you show compassion towards those weaker than you. You show compassion towards those who are helpless rather than use your physical strength to dominate them. And that it is a man's duty to protect his family, to protect his country, to protect his community. That it's a good thing to be a businessman, it's a great thing to make lots of money, but it's important ethically to do so while causing minimal harm. These are the sort of things that my grandfather taught me. So yes, there's a very stark contrast between my father and my mother's father in terms of the lessons they taught me in life. And I tend to lean more in the direction of my grandfather, but I still have certain tendencies due to the very early upbringing and training and things that my father instilled in me. And so that does affect my outlook on certain situations. And those aren't things that I think about consciously. It is just the way that I am and the way that I react. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.